And just before we start, I wanted to take a quick moment to talk about our merch, which I'm actually showing off for the first time on this channel. We've got merch for our sexy logo as well as a bunch of other designs too, although they are mostly focused around Overwatch. If you're into Overwatch, you should definitely check it out at the link in the description, and hopefully we'll have some more League of Legends designs in the future too. Thanks, and enjoy the video. What's up guys, it's me, Jeremy. Something I've always kind of respected about Riot Games is how many unique champions they've actually managed to create over the years. But despite the huge roster of available characters, we haven't really scratched the surface when it comes to a lot of the concepts that just never saw production. Riot developers spend a lot of time coming up with new archetypes or exploring old ones and messing around with all sorts of ideas, and this results in a huge number of potential champions that either never see the light of day or end up being turned into something new. This was also the case with Seth, who's a character concept that eventually was released to the player base as Azir. Interestingly enough, although they do share a lot of character traits and for the most part look very similar visually, they had actually extremely different gameplay designs, and that's what I wanted to explore today, since it shows a ton of potential with a lot of positive Rioter feedback. And if you want to look at the question of should Riot release Seth in terms of his character, that's not exactly the most exciting question because they already have released him. It's Azir. So we're looking at just the gameplay for the most part. Either way, let's jump right into it. And if you enjoy the video, please leave a like on it or let us know in the comment section below, and be sure to subscribe for some more videos. Now, when it's quite literally your job to sit around coming up with new champion concepts, you don't ever want to feel like your work has been for nothing, and so for this reason Riot has what they call an icebox. It's kind of like a resting place for characters that maybe showed a decent amount of potential and could be progressed further in the future. Different characters get iceboxed for varieties of reasons. A lot of the times it's because maybe they don't have quite the technology to make that design work in their game right now, or there are tons of other design-based reasons as well. Now, the icebox can be a great source of inspiration in future champions, and new ideas or technologies that they implement into the base game can be a great way to get champions out of the icebox and into production. Now, with Azir's case, Seth was the Icebox champion who inspired the character, but even Seth wasn't the original idea actually. It was another cancelled champion known as, well, the Hydrasoul that we've taken a look at in a previous video. We've talked about Well before, so of course I don't want to get into too much detail. Maybe we'll just link the video on him below, but to summarize, well, the Hydrasoul was a water mage developed during the League of Legends beta before the game was released, who would summon rainstorms, vortexes, and do all sorts of other watery things. At the time, League of Legends couldn't support all of the particle effects necessary to do the character justice, so it eventually resulted in his cancellation because they just didn't have the technology to make the character work. A few years later, after the visual effects improved, Well's designs served as the inspiration for a new champion, Seth the Sand Mage. As you can probably guess from the name, his abilities were kind of the same concept, except he controlled sand instead of water. The concept art that goes along with this original concept is pretty rough around the edges, but you can definitely see aspects of his gameplay and personality bleeding through. Seth wanted nothing but to turn everything into a desert, growing Shurima and his influence in the process. And Seth's abilities reflected this sort of motivation really well. A lot of what they would do is leave sand around the map for a few minutes here and there, with more abilities used leading to more sand being created. The sand that he spread around the map would allow for bonus effects if you landed an ability on an enemy who was standing in sand, such as giving your ability maybe extra range or a knockup, or perhaps giving you some passive movement speed while walking through it. In fact, some versions even incorporated a friendly sandworm that would randomly attack enemy units that were lurking above the sand. Riot eventually started referring to the worm as Lil Buddy, but he was definitely not cute to anyone on the receiving end. He probably acted as a partial inspiration for Azir's sand soldiers later on, but the key difference between Azir and Seth is that rather than navigating the battlefield and zoning enemies with sand soldiers like Azir does, Seth would instead have more of an area denial kit that would push enemies that didn't avoid his sand. It didn't take long for Riot to realize that it would be an amazing time to try to make some sort of quicksand element work in the game, so they quickly started developing the concept, and it led to probably the most notable element of Seth's kit. He would distribute sand around the map, very similar in a way to how Zerg spread creep in StarCraft. He kind of just like spread it around the whole map, trying to eventually cover almost the entire area, or at least as much as possible. It's not uncommon in StarCraft for a Zerg player to cover as much as 50% plus of the entire map, and in StarCraft the maps are of course a lot larger than League of Legends too. So imagine just covering like almost everything with sand, and then while you're walking in the sand, it does a bunch of cool stuff, like you get bonus movement speed, maybe you deal extra damage in sand, and it's a pretty big effect. So as a result, you're very much encouraged to play this sort of mini game of spreading sand throughout the entire map while your opponents are trying to stop that spread and deny it. And this sort of resulted in this gameplay dynamic that allowed him to have very long-lasting effects throughout the entire game that drastically changed the gameplay as a whole. You can probably compare it somewhat to maybe Talia's worked ground, I guess, but the difference is that it's super impactful and really beneficial to Seth, rather than just being this sort of like minor thing. His entire gameplay was based around the design of spreading sand. And remember, Seth would spread sand whenever he used abilities, so you would easily end up covering a quarter, if not half of the entire Summoner's Rift map with sand by the mid to late game. Now, despite being an awesome concept that really forced enemy players to think on their feet, Riot quickly encountered technology and performance issues once again. Even after the technological improvements that made Seth possible to actually release into the game, despite the Hydra Soul's previous issues, having so many particle effects added into a game from just one character meant that lower end computers would seriously start to struggle when playing in a game with Seth, and that's something that Riot just can't really let happen. In an attempt to counter this, they tried reducing the duration of his sand in general while also lowering the number of particles significantly. This pattern repeated a few times until eventually they realized it just wasn't going to work. They couldn't fix the technological and performance issues, and so the sand creep idea was abandoned altogether. Now, Riot Ezreal even commented on the process, saying that Riot simply just could not go into this design space if it would be detrimental to worldwide players with lower NPCs, which really broke his heart because it was so cool and such an interesting character, and it was really optimistic in terms of the gameplay and extremely fun to play with and interesting to play against. But it just didn't work out. Now, even if Riot did have to give up on the sand creep concept, there is a little bit of another piece of Seth's development history that has some really cool potential. Riot released a GIF actually showcasing one of Seth's ultimate abilities, which summoned giant sand hands that would appear and shoved enemies together. The concept art for it is amazing, and it really gives you a cool idea of what the gameplay for Seth could look like. As an ultimate ability, it would probably be used as sort of this wombo combo teamfight ultimate, or potentially just as a straight up nuke with some crowd control, like a lot of other mage ultimates. The cool thing about an ultimate like this is that it makes it really easy to invent basic abilities that kind of work alongside it. For example, you can make a quicksand ability that slows enemies to make them maybe easier to catch in the giant sand hands, or maybe he could have a point and click style route like Rise that softens the ground underneath a single enemy to briefly stop them from being able to move. It's really all about coming up with ways for abilities to interact with each other in interesting ways. These concepts would also work with the idea of some kind of sand-based worked ground mechanic, with a sandworm that pops up and deals some damage, and obviously they also make it easier to land the typical skillshot nuke that most mage kits feature. Now, I personally think the gameplay design of Seth is just absolutely fascinating and super cool. So what would it actually take to get Seth into the game? Now, obviously the biggest thing that needs to change is first off his appearance. As you can see from his character concept art, moving from Seth to Azir was a little bit of a copy paste. I mean, they're really similar. To release Seth as a new champion, Riot would have to rethink their approach entirely about how he looks and behaves so that they could differentiate the two. They might even have to change the whole aspect of sand into being something else entirely. I guess one thing I actually haven't considered is that even now it's also not clear if League can handle the particle effects and performance issues required to make these sandy particle effects work well enough on a large scale without anyone suffering in terms of their FPS. But Riot have definitely become a lot better at solving these types of technical issues compared to just even 2 years ago, let alone 6+ when Seth was originally designed. So I expect that they could probably find some sort of way to make this gameplay work. And as well, Riot would need to find a gameplay theme that Seth could fill that explores new territory. League of Legends has quite a few control mages already, but that's also definitely the best place to be with this type of kit. The concept for his ultimate is really cool though, and there's a ton of potential for a sand mage in general to provide some awesome crowd control abilities. He'd also have to be pretty immobile compared to champions like maybe Azir or Talia, but providing him more raw crowd control and some damage over time or something like that instead of maybe pure burst could possibly be a logical way to give him some interesting new gameplay that doesn't make existing control mages pointless. It kind of settles him in some sort of niche. One of the biggest arguments against Seth is that we already have multiple control mages, and a lot of them are hailing from Shurima already, but it honestly kind of goes with the territory because sand and desert themes kind of just goes so well with that kind of gameplay. I'm not sure exactly what they would do to make him work in terms of his theme and character design. As long as the kit was original and introduced some cool new concepts though, there probably wouldn't be that much of an issue with it as far as the player base is concerned. I mean, as long as he's not just a total copy of someone else or very similar, you can kind of get away with toting the line here and there. But anyway, that's going to be it for today's video actually on Seth the Sand Mage. I personally love this concept. I think it's such an interesting way to design gameplay, and Seth's gameplay design is unlike anything we've seen in League of Legends, so I really hope that Riot decides to do something cool with that sort of gameplay style in the future. Now, you guys always tend to come up with some awesome abilities and ideas for old canceled concepts like these, so definitely let us know your comments or your ideas in the comment section below. Maybe make some suggestions about what you would do if you were the developer for a new version of Seth. Either way, it looks like that's going to be it for this one. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.